Astrotheology argues that all the stories and episodes and characters in the scriptures of the Bible are built upon celestial metaphor. And actually it goes further than that. It's not just the Bible. All the myths around the world are built upon celestial metaphor. I like to use the term star myths because the word astrotheology is actually used to mean a couple of different things. And if we use the word star myths, then we can actually talk about a specific star myth, whereas astrotheology doesn't really work as well that way. But in any case, one of the things that people might be familiar with is the argument that, well, there's 12 disciples that surround Jesus, just as there are 12 zodiac signs that the sun moves through during the year, or that actually surround the orbit of the earth around the sun, such that as we move around the sun, one sign is always in the background of the sun. So the sun moves through, or is surrounded by, 12 zodiac constellations, just as Jesus is surrounded by 12 disciples. And similarly in the Old Testament, there are the 12 children of Israel. Now, just because the number 12 matches up with the 12 zodiac signs, we could actually argue that there are 13 zodiac signs, but for now let's just talk about the 12 constellations. There are 12 months of the year, but just because there's 12 months of the year and 12 disciples, that's not really a conclusive argument, or 12 children of Israel, or even 12 Olympian gods in the Greek myths, or the 12 labors of Hercules as he moves through the different labors. There are 12 for Heracles or Hercules, but still that's not conclusive to prove that they're based upon the celestial metaphor, the heavenly cycles. In Star Myths of the World, I spend over 700 pages going into great detail about this is Star Myths of the World Volume 3, Star Myths of the Bible. I go into great detail discussing specific characters in the Old and New Testament scriptures, specific episodes, and I go into the identity of the children of Israel, matching them up with different zodiac constellations. But in order to really conclusively prove that, you have to have an abundance of evidence. And I'd like to today, because I believe if we can establish that for even one of the 12 disciples, that one of those disciples is conclusively linked to one of the zodiac constellations, one of the signs that the sun moves through in the annual cycle, that will go a long way towards establishing that. And like I said, you can go through the entire Bible from Genesis, all the so-called Old Testament scriptures, or the Hebrew scriptures, and all the New Testament stories in the Gospels, and all the way up to the writings in the book of Revelation, apocryphal or apocalyptic, the apocalyptic stories in the book of Revelation, and show that they are based on celestial metaphor. But if we can show that for even one of the 12 disciples, that should go a long way towards establishing this argument. So today I'd like to dive into one of the 12 disciples, the disciple Philip. Philip is named in both of the lists of the 12 disciples that are found in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. When I was in Sunday school, I actually learned a song in about 4th grade about the 12 disciples, and I remember it was actually one of our favorite songs. We would actually clamor for this song when we were asked by the teacher, hey, which song do you want to sing to finish off the class today? And we would always say, oh, let's sing the 12 disciples song, and it starts off like this. There were 12 disciples Jesus called to help him, Simon, Peter, Andrew, James his brother, John, Philip, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas, and Bartholomew. That's based on the Matthew list, actually. The Luke list is slightly different. Instead of having someone named Thaddeus, it has 2 Judases. But both of them have Simon. Now, Philip, excuse me. Now, Philip is not the most well-known of the 12 disciples, but he is in both of those lists. And the Reverend Robert Taylor, in the early 1800s, was a pioneer of astrotheology, and he devoted an entire sermon or lecture to the identity of Philip, the disciple named Philip, who he identifies with one specific zodiac constellation, and the amount of evidence that he offers is actually quite astonishing. And although Philip isn't the most well known, the constellation that he's linked to is a very important sign in the zodiac and opens up a window to other figures both within the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and also to other myths from around the world. So it's actually a very profitable endeavor, I believe, to dive into the identity of the apostle named Philip and find his connection to a specific sign in the zodiac cycle and see how that really helps to establish the argument that all the myths and sacred stories and scriptures from around the world are based upon a common system of celestial metaphor. On May 29th, in the year 1831, an ordained minister named Robert Taylor delivered a sermon entitled St. Philip, on the identity of Philip, one of the 12 disciples. Now, Robert Taylor, his sermons were actually transcribed, they were recorded, and they were published after his death in 2 volumes entitled The Devil's Pulpit and Astronomico-Theological Lectures. And in those 2 volumes is the first place that the word astrotheology is used, to my knowledge, to mean that understanding that the scriptures are based upon celestial metaphor. And Robert Taylor was a very careful student of the scriptures, and he became convinced that all the episodes and characters in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible are based upon celestial metaphor. And not just the Bible, he clearly understood that myths from around the world are also using this same system, because he references that in some of his lectures. And he was persecuted for this kind of preaching. In fact, he was locked up in prison a total of 3 times, and totaling a period of more than 3 years. And he lost his job, and in any event, what Robert Taylor did at the beginning of that sermon was go back to a passage from the Psalms in the Old Testament, in Psalm 147, in verse 10. And he's talking about Philip in this sermon, one of the 12 disciples, one of the apostles, one of the disciples called by Jesus. But he goes back to Psalm 147, verse 10, where we read, "He delighteth not in the strength of the horse. He taketh not pleasure in the legs of a man." He delighteth not in the strength of the horse. He taketh not pleasure in the legs of a man. Robert Taylor said, that's a hard verse to interpret. But you're usually only going to get the shell of an interpretation. You're not going to get to the actual seed. He says that in his sermon. Why did he start his sermon off with that verse from Psalm 147, verse 10, if he's looking into the identity of the apostle Philip? Well, to find out what the listeners over 186 years ago learned, let's look at the scriptures and the arguments and the evidence that Robert Taylor presents as he argues for the identity of the disciple named Philip with one of the 12 zodiac stations, one of the 12 signs that the sun passes through during the annual cycle. One of the 12 zodiac stations or signs or houses that the sun passes through throughout the year. He's going to argue that each of the disciples, each of the 12 disciples, corresponds to one of the 12 zodiac signs. And specifically, he's going to look at Philip and the etymology of Philip's name, Phil Hippos, to argue for the identity of Philip with the zodiac constellation of Sagittarius. Psalm 147, verse 10. He delighteth not in the strength of the horse, he taketh not pleasure in the legs of a man. Well, this diagram of a centaur, this is actually a diagram of the constellation Sagittarius as it was envisioned in the early 1800s, Sagittarius being envisioned as a centaur even from ancient times, shows why the verse says, he delighteth not or taketh not pleasure in the legs of a man, because this centaur does not have the legs of a man. He has the upper body, the torso, the arms, the head of a human, but he's got the lower body and legs of a horse. So this is why Robert Taylor argues that this verse that says, he delighteth not in the strength of the horse, he taketh not pleasure in the legs of a man, is talking about a centaur, and specifically the constellation Sagittarius. In fact, if we posit that the 12 disciples line up with the 12 signs of the zodiac, then if we had to guess which sign of the zodiac would correspond to the disciple Philip, we would guess Sagittarius, because the name Philip itself means lover of horses, which, by the way, is the same description that is given to Hector in the Iliad. Hector is the leader of the forces of Troy, who correspond to the lower half of the zodiac cycle, and that's exactly where we find Sagittarius, right at the very bottom of the zodiac cycle. Now, the name Philip is composed of two Greek word roots, one phil, which means to love. It's different than erotic love, which is related to the word eros. Phil is loving, and we find it in the word Philadelphia for brotherly love. And hippos, which means horse or horses. So Phil Hippos means lover of horses. And in other words that we find Phil in is Philharmonic, Philadelphia, I already mentioned, philosophy. Other words that we find with hippos in them is hippodrome, hippocampus, the field of the horse, Eohippus, which is an ancient horse that's found in fossils that was named the dawn horse. Eos means dawn, so Eohippus is a dawn horse. And hippopotamus, the river horse, the horse hippo of the river, Potami. Like in Mesopotamia, it means in the middle of two rivers. You probably learned that somewhere in your history classes in like 7th or 8th grade. Mesopotamia means middle of two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and hippopotamus means the hippo, the horse of the river, hippopotamus. So based on name alone, Robert Taylor argues that Philip corresponds to Sagittarius, but he explores a whole lot more evidence which supports the conclusion that Philip is indeed representative of the constellation and the sign of Sagittarius. Continuing his investigation of the identity of Philip, Robert Taylor then looks at a passage in Acts chapter 8, beginning in verse 26, where we read that the angel of the Lord spake unto Philip, saying, Arise and go towards the south, unto the way that goeth down from Jerusalem unto Gaza, which is desert. And he arose and went, and behold, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure, and had come to Jerusalem for to worship, was returning, and sitting in his chariot, read Esaias the prophet, that is Isaiah.
Then the Spirit said unto Philip, Go near and join thyself to his chariot. And Philip ran thither to him, and heard him read the prophet Esaias, and said, Understandest thou what thou readest? And he said, How can I, except some man should guide me? And he desired Philip that he would come up and sit with him. The place of the scripture which he read was this: He was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before his shearer, so opened he not his mouth. In his humiliation his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. And the eunuch answered Philip and said, I pray thee, of whom speaketh the prophet this? Of himself, or of some other man? Then Philip opened his mouth and began at the same scripture, and preached unto him Jesus. And as they went on their way, they came unto a certain water, and the eunuch said, See, here is water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? And Philip said, If thou believest with all thine heart, thou mayest. Now let's look at the clues in this passage that help us to identify Philip with the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. Now here's the outline of the constellation Sagittarius in the sky as outlined by H.A. Rey in his very important book, The Stars, A New Way to See Them. H.A. Rey's outlines of the constellations are extremely helpful for understanding the celestial metaphor. But in this case, Sagittarius is, as we said, anciently depicted or envisioned as a centaur, but in the outline here, we don't really see how Sagittarius looks like a centaur. It looks like a person, either a male or a female person, but not really a centaur. And in fact, Sagittarius does play the role of both male and female characters in various myths around the world. But you see that long portion of Sagittarius that looks kind of like a dress? I believe that was envisioned as the body of the horse. And if you look carefully, you will see that there is a star that's in position down below the top of that long horse's body. That could be the front foot of the centaur. If that dress becomes the body of the centaur, then here's that front hoof. So now you have a horse's body with a human torso holding a bow, just like what we see in the constellation Sagittarius, the way it's depicted down through the ages as a centaur wielding a bow. And in fact, if you look above that long portion that I believe can be envisioned as the body of the horse's body portion of the centaur, you'll see that there are in fact some stars that could become the tail of the horse if Sagittarius is envisioned as a centaur. Okay, so now we'll erase those extra portions and go back to the outline of Sagittarius as shown in H.A. Rey, which is the way that I usually envision Sagittarius when I'm looking for the constellation in the night sky. But just understand how it can transform into a centaur, and that's why Sagittarius is associated with a horse or horsemen or lovers of the horse in various myths around the world. And so just based on his name, the name Philip clues us in that maybe Philip could be associated with Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is associated with horses or horsemen, and the name Philip means lover of horses. But that's obviously not enough to confirm the identity of Philip with Sagittarius. So Robert Taylor continues and looks at this episode with the Ethiopian eunuch, who the scripture says is on his way back to Ethiopia through Gaza, which is a desert. Now, as Robert Taylor points out in his sermon, Philip is actually directed to go down to the south towards Gaza, which is desert, and that is a perfect description of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is actually one of the furthest to the south of all the zodiac constellations, as we'll see. It's the furthest south below the celestial equator, and Sagittarius is going down towards the south, or down underneath the celestial equator and down towards the lowest part of the year. And actually, Robert Taylor argues that Gaza comes from the ancient Hebrew word for goat. And there, right next to Sagittarius, we have Capricorn, the goat. And in fact, Capricorn does follow Sagittarius in the annual cycle. So Sagittarius can be seen to be going toward Capricorn, or into Capricorn, or into Gaza. But is there any justification for Robert Taylor's assertion that Gaza means goat? If you look up the etymology of Gaza, you won't really find anyone saying that it comes from the word goat. You'll see that it comes from the word for a strong fortress, or all these other speculations. People don't really know where the term originally came from, but Robert Taylor is on solid ground, because in ancient Hebrew, the word "az" is used for a goat. In fact, "az" is used several times in the Old Testament to signify a goat. And so he's going to argue that "az" and Gaza are related. Now let's take a look at a few verses. Here's one from Genesis 15, where the word "az" is used. And here's one from Leviticus 3, where once again the word "az" is used. And here's one from Leviticus 7. And now here's one from Leviticus 16, where a different word is used for goat. That's not the word "az," but notice down here we have the word for scapegoat, Azazel, and that sounds also like Gaza. And here it is again. And notice that the scapegoat is being driven out into the wilderness. This is talking about the region of the sky of Capricorn. Capricorn is near a region of the sky from Capricorn and to the east, in contrast to the bright stars around Sagittarius and Scorpio, and that's where we have the brightest portion of the Milky Way. Once you get to the east of that and you start going towards Capricorn and Aquarius and Pisces, it's a very empty region of the sky as far as bright stars. And in fact, on page 56 in H.A. Ray's The Stars, A New Way to See Them, he says this is a very dull region of the sky. That's the desert that's being talked about in Acts. That's the wilderness that the goat is being driven out into in this passage here. And so Azazel, or "az," Robert Taylor is saying that Gaza reference in Acts is talking about Capricorn. Now notice, we don't even really need to argue that the actual word Gaza comes from the word for goat. It's enough to notice that here in the New Testament, where Philip is being described as going towards Gaza, that the person who put that there knew that the word Gaza relates to the word for goat. And so we have Philip, who's Sagittarius, going towards the desert of Capricorn, and that's where he's going to meet up with the Ethiopian eunuch. All right, now let's look at the identity of the eunuch. And these ancient myths are sometimes quite sexually explicit, or a little more graphic than maybe we're used to. But what they're doing is they're dressing up the constellations in different costumes, in different ways to convey an esoteric message to us. And the Ethiopian eunuch, I'm convinced, is identified with the constellation of Aquarius, and we'll see why. As outlined by H.A. Ray, the constellation Aquarius definitely looks like a running figure, running headlong. And in fact, in the Iliad and in the Odyssey and in other ancient Greek poetry, we sometimes see the description of a headlong runner, and that is usually referring to a character who can be connected to the constellation Aquarius. But that front leg of the running figure of Aquarius could and is in some ancient myths, not just in the Bible, but in other myths around the world, envisioned as a part of the male anatomy. And so based on that, you can see why this figure in the book of Acts is described as a eunuch. Okay, because, well, it should be self-evident from the outline of the constellation. Now, let's recall that the scripture tells us that this particular eunuch had gone to Jerusalem to worship and was now returning in his chariot. He's returning back to Ethiopia, presumably. So he'd gone to Jerusalem. Now, I am not going to go into the arguments for it here, but I would argue that Jerusalem is identified with the Mount of Ophiuchus. In fact, if you go back to one of my previous videos about the Ark of the Covenant, the identity of the Ark of the Covenant, which is kept in the temple at Jerusalem, I have an extensive video looking at lots of different evidence that identifies the Ark with Ophiuchus, and I believe that the temple is also identified with Ophiuchus. You can see the two pillars, the famous two pillars of the great temple right there in the night sky. So the Ethiopian eunuch is coming down from Ophiuchus, and he's heading back to what could be the place that he's going back towards. I believe it's the great city of the square of Pisces, or of Pegasus, the great square there in between the constellation Pisces and the queen that is referred to is Candace. The Queen Candace of Ethiopia, I believe, is identified with Andromeda. Andromeda is right next to the Great Square. So that's where this individual is going back to. He's coming from Ophiuchus or from Jerusalem, and he's going towards back to his own city in Ethiopia where the Queen Candace reigns, and that's the Great Square and Andromeda. By the way, we've left the sermon of Robert Taylor here. He makes that connection for Gaza with the goat, but after that, he doesn't make the connection to the constellation Aquarius that I just argued, or to the constellations of the Great Square and Andromeda. But now let's take a look at some evidence that supports the identification of Aquarius. As I said, this forward leg of the running figure of Aquarius was seen in ancient myth as sometimes envisioned as a portion of the male anatomy, and that's actually present in the story of Noah and his sons after the flood, when Noah plants the first vineyard and then gets drunk and is naked, and then his nakedness is uncovered and called attention to by Ham, and then Ham's two brothers Shem and Japheth walk backwards with a sheet to cover their father's nakedness. I am convinced, and I've argued this elsewhere quite extensively, that the two brothers who walk backwards with the sheet between them to cover their father's nakedness are none other than the two fishes of Pisces, and in between them there's that great square. That's the sheet that they're walking backwards between their shoulders. And the brother who calls attention to the nakedness of Noah is Capricorn. That's Ham. Capricorn is pointing right to that forward leg, quote unquote, forward leg of Aquarius. And in fact, if you look at some artwork down through the centuries, you'll see references to these constellations. You'll see that Noah is often depicted in a posture that resembles the outline of the constellation Aquarius. And there's Ham pointing to Noah's nakedness. And look at the way Ham's hand and arm signals resemble the outline of Capricorn. And then the brothers Shem and Japheth are walking the sheet backwards between them. Here's another example from the 1400s. And you should be able to see that the posture of Noah himself strongly resembles the outline of Aquarius in the sky as outlined by H.A. Ray in 1952. You can see the position of the legs. Also, Noah has his hand to his forehead instead of carrying the pitcher of water is envisioned as Noah holding his hand to his forehead. Notice the corner of the vineyard there. The vineyard, I'm convinced, in this and many other ancient myths, is identified with the great square of Pegasus. That should be sufficient evidence to demonstrate that the figure of Aquarius is sometimes envisioned in ancient mythology as having to do with nakedness of a male character. And this, I believe, is supporting evidence for the identification of the Ethiopian eunuch in the story in Acts with the constellation of Aquarius. And that's further supporting evidence for our argument that Sagittarius corresponds to the figure of Philip. But what about the fact that this character, the Ethiopian eunuch, now remember we shouldn't get caught up in the physical description because we're actually talking about a celestial character, a constellation in the sky, not from any place on earth. We're not supposed to be getting caught up in focusing on the physical with these stories. They're not literal stories. Okay, but the Ethiopian eunuch in this story has a chariot. Where's the chariot? I don't see a chariot here in the constellations. In other myths, we've seen that Boötes often plays the role of a charioteer, and the horses in that case are identified with the great horses in the Big Dipper. But in this case, I believe that the chariot has to do with a different horse, one that's closer to the constellation of Aquarius, and that is the Horse of Pegasus itself. Pegasus is right next to Aquarius, and of course right next to the great square of Pegasus, the great square being the wing of the winged horse Pegasus. But Pegasus can also play the role of a horse in a chariot, as it does in this case in the book of Acts. And once again, we can look in other myths and see precedent or supporting evidence to reinforce this conclusion that Pegasus is playing the role of the horses in this chariot that is found in the episode in Acts with Philip. And that's in the story of Troilus in the Iliad. Achilles pursues and then slays a youth named Troilus. And you can see him here. He's actually riding on 2 horses. And if you look there, you can see a water pitcher or a water vessel broken on the ground underneath the horses. And this is because Troilus was searching for water when Achilles ambushed him. But also, this shows that we've got the same region of the sky with Aquarius. And if you look closely, you can see there's actually 2 tails to those horses. There's actually 2 horses that Troilus is riding if you count the hooves. Or look at the heads of the horses, you'll see that there's actually 2 horses there. And if you look at the constellation Pegasus in the sky, you'll see that there's actually 2 tails in the outline of the constellation. So I believe that shows that the ancient system sometimes envisions Pegasus as being 2 horses side by side, not just 1 horse. And in fact, if we go to some fragments of a play by the great ancient Greek tragedian Sophocles, famous ancient Greek playwright, he wrote a play called the Troilus. Unfortunately, we only have fragments of that play remaining, but in that play by the tragedian or writer of tragedies Sophocles, Troilus is ambushed and slain by Achilles, and then he is actually mutilated, in a word which means his male genitals are cut off by Achilles. So we can see that there is a connection. There's a this understanding of the figure of Aquarius as sometimes being mutilated, as in the account of Philip and the eunuch is found across the ancient myths. And in fact, in the Sophocles fragments that we have of Troilus, he's writing, Troilus is actually writing along with his Greek mentor, his teacher, his philosophy instructor, who is a eunuch. So this understanding, or this connection of Aquarius at times to a naked male figure, but sometimes castrated, is found in other myths, not just in the account of Philip in the book of Acts. But notice that it's a celestial description. We're not talking about a literal eunuch from the terrestrial land of Ethiopia. If you focus in on that, then you're missing the fact that these are pointing to the celestial realm. The descriptions are helping us to identify the characters as being associated with Aquarius, and that helps us to identify Philip as being associated with Sagittarius. So don't get caught up in trying to say, oh, this is about some kind of a racial thing because it mentions an Ethiopian. That's because he's going down from Jerusalem through Gaza towards his home. So that's pointing us towards the region of Sagittarius, that is Philip chasing down towards Gaza, as in Sagittarius going towards Capricorn, just as the annual cycle goes towards from Sagittarius to Capricorn. So don't get caught up in the literal description here. These are celestial figures. Now let's look at a couple more clues from the actual scriptural text, which really help to conclusively identify this scene in the night sky. And that is, first of all, the text that the character of the Ethiopian is reading from the scripture, the scroll of Isaiah. And he's reading actually from Isaiah chapter 53, and it tells us in Acts, where it reads that he was oppressed, he was afflicted, he opened not his mouth, he is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. That's from Isaiah 53 and verse 7. And look at where Aquarius is pointing towards, where the head of Aquarius is looking towards in the sky. It's looking towards the zodiac sign of Aries, the ram. Very distinctive constellation, a small constellation. That is Aries the ram. It can be envisioned with horns. Those are actually pretty faint stars that make up the horns of Aries, or without, in which case it's a lamb or sometimes a female sheep. And that is Aries. Aries plays the role of a sheep, either a ram or as a lamb. And that's exactly what Aquarius is looking towards. But he says to Philip, hey, how can I understand this unless somebody explains it to me? That's because this text is talking about esoteric things. It's actually a clue right there in the text that it's difficult to understand the esoteric meaning, that this is actually based upon celestial metaphor. It's kind of like when Samson asks a riddle. He says, hey, out of the eater I took something to eat. And then he turns that into a riddle because he's talking about a celestial riddle. It's not there to actually confuse us. It's there actually, as we'll discuss later, to convey important truths to us in an esoteric manner. But the character that Philip comes across, Philip says, hey, do you understand what you're reading? And the Ethiopian says, no, how can I unless someone explains it to me? And he's reading about another celestial figure that he's pointing right towards, the figure of Aries. And that's why we're told that he's reading this particular text, because he's reading about the Lamb of the heavens, the celestial Lamb that is Aries. And then he asks, hey, here's water. Why can't I be baptized? And so Philip says, hey, let's stop the chariot. and I'll baptize you. Now, this is yet one more confirmatory detail in the text that we are focusing on the correct region of the sky, because when there's baptizing going on, it is usually associated with the figure of Aquarius. And here's a depiction of John the Baptist, and you can see he's in the posture that corresponds exactly to the constellation Aquarius. And John the Baptist actually says, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." He's Aquarius. He's also looking towards Aries in that different episode that's found in the Gospels. So I think with that celestial evidence, we can really see that the character of Philip is connected to the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. But that's not all, because Robert Taylor actually then connects the figure of Sagittarius to the Old Testament figure of Joseph. Joseph, one of the 12 children of Israel, and the one who is thrown down into a pit by his brothers because they're jealous of him, and then he's sold into slavery in Egypt. We're going to see a lot of textual evidence that Joseph actually corresponds to the constellation Sagittarius, just as Philip does. But here's a painting from 1602, which has a lot of the artistic conventions surrounding Joseph when he's shown being sold into slavery by his brothers. See how his hands are crossed? I am convinced that that is a reference to the bow of Sagittarius, which is envisioned in this scene as Joseph's hands being crossed. We'll see that again and again in other artwork. And you can see over Joseph's head, one of the brothers is showing a Capricorn hand signal. That upraised thumb is the bobtail of the goat, and then the pointing fingers is the horns of the goat of Capricorn. And other brothers are doing celestial things as well. You see one of the brothers receiving the coins into his apron or into his shirt front, and that's typical of depictions. And that's the sheet in between the two fishes of Pisces. The two hands holding the sheet represent Pisces, and the merchant who's dropping the coins, paying for Joseph, is in a posture that's typical of Aquarius. So that's Aquarius again, dropping the coins into the square of Pegasus in between the fishes of Pisces, just as you have Sagittarius, Capricorn, then Aquarius, which is pointing towards the Great Square, and Pisces. And these artistic conventions down through the centuries shows that somebody knew these celestial connections, even as the scriptures were being taught as if they were talking about literal and historical personages, when they're clearly talking about celestial figures in celestial situations. Now, as Robert Taylor explains in his sermon on Philip, in which he argues that Philip corresponds to Sagittarius and Joseph in the book of Genesis corresponds to Sagittarius, as he explains, the reason why Joseph is thrown down into a pit is because Sagittarius is one of the zodiac constellations that is furthest below the celestial equator. What I'm showing here is the zodiac constellations, and I've removed the horizon so you can see all the way down to the celestial South Pole. You can see the grid squares on the imaginary celestial sphere. And here is the outline of the zodiac constellations. I'll draw those in. And then here is the line that represents the celestial equator. That is the line in the night sky that's 90 degrees down from the north celestial pole or 90 degrees up from the south celestial pole. And in this diagram, the north celestial pole is actually over our heads. You can't see it, but the south celestial pole is where all those lines are coming together and all the circles are coming together. So 90 degrees up from that point is the celestial equator that you see drawn in. And you can see that the zodiac crosses that celestial equator, and it dips down below the celestial equator, the crossing point in Virgo, Virgo being the yellow constellation that you see on the far right of your screen. And then it gets all the way down to the lowest point between Scorpio and Sagittarius, and then it starts to curve back upwards. You can see that the celestial equator actually crosses through the head of Aquarius, and then after Aquarius, we have Pisces is actually above the celestial equator, and then Aries is further above the celestial equator to the north. So Sagittarius is down in the pit, and that's why Joseph, who corresponds with Sagittarius, is thrown down into the pit by his other 11 brothers, who are the other zodiac constellations, as we just saw depicted in that artist's rendition. Now we'll dive into some of the other textual details from the scriptures themselves that prove that Joseph corresponds to Sagittarius. But before we leave that idea of Joseph Sagittarius being thrown down into the pit, let's take a look at another artistic depiction of the scene of Joseph being sold into slavery. And here he's actually shown down in the pit, and he's actually being lifted up out of the pit after he's been thrown down in the pit. Now his brothers are selling him to the merchants, the traveling Ishmaelites, the children of Ishmael, descendants of Ishmael. And let's see how many celestial correspondences this artist from the mid-1600s has put into this painting. First of all, let's look at the character of Joseph himself as he's coming up out of that well. You can see that his head is pretty much corresponding in its shape and its angle to the triangular head of Sagittarius. And look, that plume of Sagittarius, that feather that sticks up from the head of Sagittarius, actually corresponds to the rope that's being used to pull Joseph out of the well. Now, I would argue that this artist has even incorporated some of the shapes that you see in the night sky corresponding to the bow of Sagittarius, the distinctive bow of Sagittarius, into his depiction of Joseph. As you can see, I've outlined it here. This is my interpretation of those shapes that he's incorporated into his painting to suggest the shape of the bow of Sagittarius. Now, off to the left of Joseph in this painting, which is accurate, it corresponds to what we would see to the east of Sagittarius. If we're looking to the south, we see some sheep. We see actually in the distance a goat being killed. That's the goat that is used to put blood on the coat of Joseph that the brothers used to then take to their father Jacob and say, we found this coat covered with blood. And then we see this shepherd kind of standing with a distinctive hand and arm signal again. All of this is representative of or evocative of the constellation Capricorn, which is on that side of Sagittarius. And then to the right of Joseph being pulled out of the well, as we face the painting, to the right of Joseph as we look at it, we see one of his other brothers leaning against a donkey, and his body shape is actually very evocative of the constellation Scorpio, which is just to the right or west of Sagittarius as we face it in the sky. If we're in the northern hemisphere, as we're looking at Sagittarius, we have to look towards the south, and to the right or west would be Scorpio, right where this brother is, whose body shape is so sinuous as he leans against that donkey, as he looks just like the constellation Scorpio. And then here's just one more illustration, this one from about AD 1180, and it shows Joseph being sold into slavery. And once again, those distinctive artistic elements of Joseph's hands being crossed. Then we have the brother putting the coins into the apron or a sheet held between the hands there to the left of Joseph. Notice that Joseph is looking in the opposite direction that he's walking. That's a characteristic of Sagittarius that becomes important in some other myths. But you also see that Joseph's hands are tied with a rope, and that rope kind of dips down, and then over where that rope comes up, you see kind of a cat of 9 tails, but it's really a cat of 3 tails. That whole rope feature with the little whip or little scourge there with the 3 ropes on the top of it is representative of Scorpio, which is, as we've said, to the right of Sagittarius if we're facing to the south. You can also see some celestial hand and arm signals being depicted in that artist painting from 1180. Now, after Joseph gets to Egypt, he becomes a slave in the household of Potiphar, and then there's the incident with Potiphar's wife. She is attracted to Joseph. She wants Joseph to sleep with her, and Joseph says, "No, I can't do that. Your husband trusts me with all these things. How could I betray that trust?" And in order to get away from her amorous advances, he runs away, he flees, and he leaves his cloak with her. Now, what constellation do you think could play the role of a male figure who's fleeing and then his clothing gets ripped off? That's right. Once again, this is Aquarius. Remember, we've seen that Aquarius is sometimes a male figure in a state of undress in the case of Noah. Well, here we have Joseph having his clothes or his outer clothing ripped off by Potiphar's wife as he flees. And notice, of course, that Aquarius is a running figure in the sky. Looks like he's running. Now, Robert Taylor argues, and I agree with him, that Potiphar's wife probably corresponds to the constellation Virgo. And notice that Virgo, that's the yellow constellation there, has a distinctive outstretched arm. She's also kind of recumbent in the sky, and she actually says in the scriptural text itself, "Lie with me." She commands Joseph, "Lie with me." Well, you can see that the constellation Virgo is in fact recumbent or reclining as it crosses the sky and has this distinctive outstretched arm. And Joseph, of course, is Sagittarius, but then when she pulls his cloak off, he runs away in a state of undress. Then he becomes associated with Aquarius at that part of the story. Now, this episode is found in Genesis 39, and as the text continues, as Joseph flees, he leaves his garment in her hand, the text tells us. And then when she sees that he has fled and left his garment in her hand, she goes and accuses him to the other men in the household and says, "Oh, look, this Hebrew slave was trying to sleep with me, and he left his garment here." And then the text says she keeps his garment nearby her, and then she accuses Joseph to her husband. Now, I would argue that the garment that Joseph leaves behind as he flees is actually depicted in the sky or corresponds to a constellation that we can see in the night sky, and that would be the sinuous form of Hydra. Hydra actually plays a garment in many other myths, including the Gilgamesh epic, as I discuss in Star Myths of the World, Volume 1. And it's also possible that Scorpio could be the garment as it's being ripped off of Joseph when he's Sagittarius, just before he flees in the form of Aquarius. It's not definitive, but because she keeps the garment by her, that's a pretty clear indication that we're talking about Hydra at that point. That's the garment that's close to Virgo. Hydra, of course, is a snake in the night sky, but all these different constellations are envisioned in different myths as different things, and sometimes Hydra, the serpent, can be actually a cloth or a garment next to Virgo. One of the reasons that I'm confident that the garment that Potiphar's wife keeps by her corresponds to Hydra is that in another set of ancient scriptures, this time from ancient India, the Mahabharata, which is a Sanskrit epic, there is a famous scene, actually a crucial moment in the drama, in which the beautiful Draupadi is insulted and publicly humiliated in the court of Duryodhan and by Dushashan, his brother. These are the adversaries. In the Mahabharata, it's kind of like the Iliad, where there are two opposing sides. There are the Pandavas and the Kauravas, and the leader of the Kauravas, that's the adversarial side. The Pandavas are kind of the good guys in the story, is Duryodhan, and his brother, his kind of second in command, is Dushashan. And Dushashan is humiliating Draupadi by trying to pull her clothes off, pull her sari off of her. And she calls upon the Lord Krishna for help, and he responds by giving her an unending sari, an unending wrapping of clothing. No matter how much Dushashan pulls, Krishna keeps supplying more clothing for Draupadi so that she's not completely naked. So, as I've explained in other places, this unending, miraculous supply of clothing, this unending sari that's given to Draupadi, corresponds to the constellation Hydra. The beautiful Draupadi, of course, corresponds to Virgo, right next to Hydra. And Dushashan, there, who's pulling off her clothing, almost certainly corresponds to Ophiuchus, with his two serpents being the clothing that he's pulling on. Here's that same region of the sky again, and there's Ophiuchus, who almost certainly plays the role of Dushashan. So this same region of the sky is depicted in Genesis in the story of Joseph with Potiphar's wife, and in the Mahabharata it is the same setting, the same celestial setting that corresponds to the humiliation of Draupadi by Dushashan. Now, it's interesting and noteworthy that down through the centuries, different artists have depicted this scene between Joseph and Potiphar's wife in different ways, and have actually used the symbology or artistic conventions that are appropriate to some of the other constellations, not simply Virgo. Here's one in which Potiphar's wife is seen grasping the garment of Joseph, but behind her you can see the outline of a pavilion, or like a canopy, and that's actually indicative of the constellation Ophiuchus. And that would actually be another possibility for the identity of Potiphar's wife. Remember, we saw in the story of Draupadi and Dushashan, where Dushashan is pulling the garment off of Draupadi in the humiliation of Draupadi, that he is almost certainly associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. There's other clues in the text that I didn't really go into, but that I do explore in Star Myths of the World, Volume 1, that shows that Dushashan is definitely associated with Ophiuchus. And that would make sense because Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, those serpents could be seen as a garment that Ophiuchus is pulling. But Ophiuchus is in the region of Sagittarius, Joseph being associated with Sagittarius, and then I believe when he flees, he's associated with Aquarius again. But the garment could be the constellation Hydra, could be associated with Ophiuchus, and this canopy indicates that that artist is making a connection to the constellation Ophiuchus. Now here's another painting of the same scene. This is Potiphar's wife. This is actually a fairly erotic depiction of Potiphar's wife. This is from the 1800s, and the artist has chosen not to put Joseph in the scene. It's interesting. He's just off the scene. He's out of the canvas to the right, but his garment, you can see that she's grasping his garment. But I would argue that this artist has chosen to use artistic conventions that are, can you look at it and guess, that are appropriate actually to the constellation of Sagittarius, the very constellation that I argue is associated with Joseph. So we're still dealing with the same region of the sky, but in this case, the artist in the 1800s is putting in conventions from Sagittarius. Some of those conventions being, let's take a look in the painting here, the very distinctive bow shape of Sagittarius. We've seen that Sagittarius in the night sky carries a bow, and that the actual shape of the bow is kind of like a backwards bow, if you think about it. But that shape of the Sagittarius bow has been incorporated into this painting with the pillow and her arm there. You can see that. And then also this distinctive top knot that is found even in ancient Greek art, where there's a Sagittarius figure, as I discuss in some of my other work. This top knot is an indicator that we're dealing with a Sagittarius figure, because Sagittarius has that plume on the top of the outline, as we see in the night sky. We can once again point out how important the outlining system published by H.A. Ray in 1952 is for seeing these connections. Note also in this painting that the shape of the garment that Potiphar's wife is grasping in her hand actually forms the sinuous outline that's associated with the constellation Scorpio. So I would argue that down through the centuries, at least in these artistic conventions taught apparently in the fine art schools, there is preserved an awareness of these connections to the constellations underlying the actual biblical stories. If not understood by the artists themselves, those conventions were at some point in time codified and then passed down through the centuries and encoded in these works of art. In addition to the celestial clues in the works of art, of course, the clues, the indicators, are present in the ancient scriptural texts themselves. And let's just visit a few more celestial indicators within the texts themselves to really cement the identification of Joseph with Sagittarius, this time going to the famous blessing given by Jacob, Israel, to his sons in Genesis 49. Let's go through what the blessings given to Joseph are, and then we'll match them up with what I believe the celestial correspondences are. In verse 22 of Genesis 49, Jacob says, "Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall." But note that the gloss, or the margin note, says that the original Hebrew word is not really branches running over the wall, it's daughters running over the wall. That's interesting. Then in Genesis 50 verse 24, we see, "But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob." You may find that verse familiar that says, "His hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty," because it appears in the famous song by the great Bob Marley, Redemption Song, where he says, "My hands were made strong by the hands of the Almighty." That comes from this verse in Genesis 49, and we'll see the celestial foundation for that particular verse in a moment. A little further down in verse 26 we read, "The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren." Interesting. These are definitive textual indicators that Joseph corresponds to the constellation Sagittarius, just as Philip in the so-called New Testament corresponds to Sagittarius. First of all, that part about Joseph having daughters who run over the wall, or described as being like branches who run over the wall. And Robert Taylor points out that Philip is also described as having 4 virgin daughters who prophesy. But back to this Genesis 49 passage, the daughters of Sagittarius who are running over the wall are actually a reference to Scorpio. Scorpio appears to be like branches running over a wall, but also Scorpio appears as a group of maidens accompanying a Sagittarius figure in many different ancient myths. When a goddess goes to bathe at the sacred spring, that is the widest part of the Milky Way. I discussed this in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, which deals with the Greek myths. There's many, many myths in which a goddess, either Aphrodite or Artemis, goes to a spring accompanied by her maidens or her nymphs or her graces, and that is describing Sagittarius along with Scorpio. And likewise here in Genesis, where Joseph is associated with Sagittarius, he has daughters who are like branches running over a wall. And likewise in the so-called New Testament, where Philip is also associated with Sagittarius, he also has virgin daughters. That's pretty clear indication that we're talking about a Sagittarius figure. Next, we find the passage where, in the blessing of Jacob, speaking about Joseph, he says, "But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty." This is the bow, obviously, of Sagittarius, but also it abode in strength because these are the brightest stars in Sagittarius. This is something that Robert Taylor argues in his discussion of these passages. His hands are made strong because these are the brightest stars in Sagittarius, are the stars that correspond to the bow and the hands of Sagittarius drawing the bow. These brightest stars of Sagittarius are sometimes referred to as the teapot because those stars are so much brighter than the other stars of Sagittarius. That's practically all you can see until you really learn how to make out the entire form of the constellation. Next, we looked at the blessings in Genesis 49, verse 26, where it says that the blessings prevail unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. Now, Robert Taylor in his sermon refers to this, but it sounds like he was probably referring to a diagram, and what he was pointing to is not recorded. I believe the everlasting hills here refer to Ophiuchus, which has a hill shape and does take on the role of hills in various myths. You can look through volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Star Myths of the World and How to Interpret Them, particularly volumes 2 and 3, to see that. And also, not just Ophiuchus, but right next to Ophiuchus is the Zodiac constellation of Libra, the scales. Also has a similar peak at the top of the constellation. Both Ophiuchus and Libra are hill-shaped. I believe these are the everlasting hills. Why are they everlasting? Because they're in the stars. These are hills that you can look upon today, and they are the same everlasting constellations that are referred to in the ancient myths of the world. And finally, we have this passage in the blessing given to Joseph where it talks about the blessing on the head of Joseph, the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brethren. He was separate from his brethren in the Genesis story because they threw him into a well and then sold him into slavery, and then he was separate from them when he was down in Egypt. But as we saw, that also has a celestial component. He was separate because he's so far down below all the other zodiac constellations other than Scorpio. He's down there with Scorpio way below the celestial equator, so he's south of all his brethren in the zodiac. But what about this crown? The passage only refers to a crown in conjunction with Joseph, as Robert Taylor points out in his sermon, and that's because right there in the night sky, right next to the zodiac constellation of Sagittarius, is the beautiful arc-shaped constellation known as Corona Australis, or the Southern Crown. It's the only crown that's next to a zodiac constellation. The Southern Crown is located right next to Sagittarius, and it is referenced in some mythical and other biblical passages that have to do with a Sagittarius figure. So we started with the disciple Philip, but we saw that Philip is connected to Sagittarius, and that points us back to Joseph in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, who's also connected to Sagittarius, all the way back in Genesis. And then, as Robert Taylor points out, we can go all the way to the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament and see there in a passage in Revelation 6 another Sagittarius figure with some very clear Sagittarius references. We don't really need to go into great detail. You should see just by reading this passage that we're referring to a Sagittarius figure here as well. In Revelation 6 it says, "And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer." Revelation 6 and verse 2. That's actually one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's the first horseman of the apocalypse, and he corresponds to Sagittarius. And this is something that Robert Taylor also points out in his lecture on Philip. So we started at Philip, went all the way from Genesis to Revelation. The entire scriptures of the so-called Old and New Testament are based upon this extremely ancient and worldwide system. That's why I say so-called Old and New Testaments, because these stories are built upon a foundation of celestial metaphor that's actually found in the stories of ancient Egypt, or the scriptures of ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts, the scriptures of ancient Mesopotamia, the clay tablets, including the Gilgamesh series. So this is an extremely ancient system. It's so ancient, it was fully formed by the time of ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient China, ancient India. This worldwide system is extremely ancient, and we can see that it informs the scriptures of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And actually, something very interesting in Robert Taylor's lecture on Philip, he notes that there's a extra biblical tradition. It's not found in the canonical scriptures. It's not found in the books that are included in the New Testament, but there's a tradition that Philip later went on and chased some serpent out of Hierapolis, where the citizens of the city were worshippers of a great serpent or a dragon. And when Philip got there and saw that they were all worshiping this great serpent, he said some urgent prayers and caused the serpent to die or to vanish from Hierapolis from that point forward. And so in his sermon on Philip, Robert Taylor notices this and says this has to do with Sagittarius chasing a serpent from the sky, the Serpent of Hydra. And as I thought about that, it occurred to me that it might also correspond to the story of St. Patrick chasing the serpents from Ireland. Now, Robert Taylor doesn't talk about St. Patrick in this sermon. He talks about Philip causing the dragon or the serpent to vanish. But notice that St. Patrick was a captive, just like Joseph. Remember, Joseph was cast down into the well, sold into slavery by his brothers. St. Patrick, according to the traditional account of his life, was taken captive and was a servant or a slave in Ireland. He was born in Britain, and when he was 16, he was captured by pirates and taken to Ireland, where he was employed as a shepherd, or he looked after animals. And the zodiac, of course, is the zoo, the animals of the sky, but Sagittarius in particular appears as a shepherd in many different myths from around the world because of the fact that Sagittarius is right next to the goat of Capricorn. Now, when St. Patrick goes to Ireland, it's also a very famous part of the tradition that he chased out or drove out all the serpents from Ireland. He banished all the snakes from Ireland, and to this day there's never been snakes in Ireland because of St. Patrick. Now, based on what Robert Taylor said, that Sagittarius drives Hydra out of the sky, which is why the ancient disciple Philip is described as driving this serpent of extraordinary bigness out of the sacred city of Hierapolis, we can apply that to the story of St. Patrick and see that Sagittarius does indeed cause Hydra to sink down into the west. In other words, because of their relative positions in the vault of the heavens, when Sagittarius is rising, Hydra, the great serpent, a very long constellation, begins to sink down into the west and is eventually driven out of the heavens, out of the holy city, by Sagittarius. And we'll see that take place right here in this series of screenshots from the planetarium app Stellarium. You can see Sagittarius beginning to rise. Sagittarius is in yellow, and Hydra beginning to sink down. Hydra, of course, being outlined in green here. And there it goes. That sequence, plus the fact that when St. Patrick was taken to Ireland, he was employed as a shepherd, should pretty much conclusively establish the connection to Sagittarius. But there's one more very well-known aspect of St. Patrick, and that, of course, is beyond his association with Ireland, his association with the shamrock. And as we saw in some of the iconography of St. Patrick, he's depicted as holding a three-leafed shamrock. And if you look back at the constellation of Sagittarius, the distinctive bow feature of Sagittarius, which actually gives Sagittarius its name, the archer, has three distinctive branches to the outline of that bow. And those three branches of the outline of the bow of Sagittarius, I would argue, give rise to the association of St. Patrick with the shamrock. And I would also suggest that that distinctive hand gesture that St. Patrick is showing in this iconography of St. Patrick, where he's holding the shamrock. Why is he holding the shamrock like that in the fourth and fifth fingers and thumb of his hand, which is a strange way to hold the shamrock? It's so that he can hold his index finger and his middle finger in that specific hand position, or mudra, to use the Sanskrit term. That specific hand gesture, I would suggest, corresponds to the constellation of Sagittarius, because it refers to that plume or feather that's coming out of the top of the outline of Sagittarius in the night sky. And I'm sure that you've noticed many people have commented upon the distinctive hand gestures that are often depicted on the disciples in artwork down through the centuries, the different hand gestures that correspond to different signs or constellations in the zodiac. That is because the disciples themselves are, in fact, personifications of the zodiac signs. By the way, in this Da Vinci painting, can you identify which one corresponds to Philip? It's not one with his finger in the air in that mudra that we saw earlier. In the Da Vinci painting, we don't actually have anybody displaying that specific hand position or mudra that we saw on St. Patrick. We do see one disciple with one finger pointed in the air, but that's actually corresponds to a hand signal or mudra for Capricorn. If you go back to some of the depictions of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you'll see that Ham is making this hand and arm signal in one of the pieces of art that we showed earlier, and that corresponds with Capricorn. We saw earlier that Ham corresponds to Capricorn, and the disciple that corresponds, or who corresponds with Capricorn, is Thomas. Robert Taylor also argues that doubting Thomas corresponds to Capricorn, and I've written a lot about how Thomas corresponds to Capricorn. You should be able to see from these artistic depictions that the straight goat horn hand position corresponds to Thomas. It's different than the one that we saw on St. Patrick that I argue corresponds to Sagittarius. Here's another example of a Thomas hand gesture that corresponds with Capricorn. So in this Da Vinci, coming back to the Da Vinci depiction of the Last Supper, the disciple with his finger pointing straight up in the air, that's not Sagittarius. That's Thomas corresponding to Capricorn. And we actually know this from Da Vinci's own notes, but rather the one who is placing his two hands towards his breast, towards his breastbone, just as we saw in the paintings of Joseph being sold into slavery, where we saw his hands crossed over his chest. This is Philip, and that is actually identified in Da Vinci's own notes, which were discovered centuries later, that this is Philip. And look at those hands, look at the hand gesture that he's making, and you can see the correspondence back to the paintings and the artistic conventions for the depiction of Joseph from the book of Genesis that we examined earlier, which once again helps to confirm everything that we've been talking about. So what does all this mean? I am convinced that the ancient scriptures are using these celestial cycles to convey profound spiritual truths, and that they use the heavenly realms to convey and to picture for us truths about the invisible realm. As Robert Taylor explains in that sermon on Philip that he gave so many years ago, the 12 disciples that you read about in the Gospels are the 12 zodiac signs. They are the only ones who always proclaim the good news. This is what Robert Taylor actually says in that sermon. Only those heavenly disciples can be said to always be proclaiming forever, for everlasting, the good news. They're the only ones, Robert Taylor explains, who can be said to cast out devils. That is to say, to cast out their adversaries. The very word devil comes from the word for adversary. That is, the adverse sign, their own adversarial or opposite sign. The sign that's opposite to them is their adversary, and by their rising, they are casting down their opposite number, just as we saw with the illustration of how St. Patrick in the heavens drives out the Serpent of Hydra. All the zodiac signs are actually doing that as the Earth turns around on its daily cycle and as it moves around the sun in its annual cycle. And the heavenly disciples are the only ones who can be said to handle serpents and not be harmed, just as we saw with the illustration. There's many heavenly serpents. There's 4 main heavenly serpents. So Robert Taylor argues that it's the heavenly signs who are the real disciples, And I would argue that that's because what these ancient myths from around the world, including the stories in the Bible, are doing is they are proclaiming to us a truth about an invisible realm and an infinite realm. That's why they use the infinite heavens. And we all actually we have a physical nature, but we also have a spiritual nature. We all have a invisible component, a spiritual component, a divine component, a divine spark. And that's why when we read these stories literally, they are often turned completely on their heads and we go so wrong. Like we saw in the story of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's not about different races. That if it is forced into meaning something about, oh, the different races are descended from the 3 different sons of Noah. No, they're not. The sons of Noah, as we saw, are constellations. They're heavenly signs. So they're not talking about, hey, focus on everybody's physical exterior. Oh, what race are you? Are you descended from Shem? Are you descended from Ham? Are you descended from Japheth? That would be to get the opposite message, that we're supposed to concentrate on the external. These ancient myths are actually talking about the invisible realm, to focus on the spiritual, the part you cannot see. They have to in order to talk about the invisible realm, they give us pictures and they use the most majestic and awe-inspiring pictures possible. They use the actual heavens above, which are representative of, they're not the actual spiritual realm. The stars are not the actual spiritual realm, but they are an infinite realm, and they depict for us truths about a real spiritual, invisible realm. And we all actually, no matter what our external appearance is, we all actually, and we know this about ourselves, have an invisible component, an infinite component, and we actually have the capability of having an inner connection with the infinite. Every single person you ever meet has an infinite component, and that's why you should not, and that's why it's so wrong to try and reduce them to a physical component only. And those who do that are inverting the message, I would argue. So the figure of Philip and all these other Sagittarius figures, remember we saw that Sagittarius is way down in the pit of the year, in the lowest part of the year. He's the sign that's thrown down into slavery. He's the sign that's cast down into the pit. But he is the sign that reminds us to rise back up, just like in the story of Joseph, that we're supposed to be getting in touch. We're supposed to overcome our physical nature and get in touch with our spiritual nature. Just as Joseph, he was cast down into slavery, but he in that story, he triumphs, he elevates, he gets in touch with the spiritual world. He's the one who can interpret dreams and visions, and who has the ability to save Egypt by his foresight. That has to do with, he is raising up his spiritual nature. And then he tries to raise up the spiritual nature of his brothers too. They're the ones who did him wrong, but he tries to elevate them as well. So to the degree that we can, we're supposed to be elevating that spiritual side of ourselves and others. That's what I believe these stories about Sagittarius figures at the lowest part of the year, but coming up out of the pit, is trying to tell us, are trying to convey to us esoterically in the language of the stars.